So I might be ruining some of my questions, but how did you and Jenny meet, and where, and what was that?
We met in college, actually. I was in the cafeteria, and she came in with some friends, and I was in the line with my best friend, and I said to him, "Brian, who is that?" And he said, "That's Jenny Bowen." And I said, "I'm going to ask her out." And he said, "Well, she's dating this friend of mine." And I said, "Are you kidding me?"
I'm still going for it.
Yeah. So I just waited until they weren't dating anymore, which was about a month, and I asked her out, and the rest is history.
Here we are.
Yeah.
So you're saying you didn't meet Jenny on a school bus in Alabama?
No.
I know, right?
No.
This is disappointing.
It's interesting because I dated 27 girls before I met her.
The exact number.
Well, only because I had dated this girl for 4.5 years, and we broke up, and then that's when I really sort of sensed that I was supposed to do something related to ministry. I never necessarily thought about being a pastor, but there's a lot of, I view what I'm doing now as ministry, so I have a much more holistic view of that. But I thought about what I wanted in a wife, and by that point I was about 23 years old, so I was a little bit older than the typical college kids, you know, and I thought a lot about what I wanted in a wife and the qualities, and so some girls I dated one time, and I thought, yep, no reason to date her again, you know, I just, you know.
You knew.
I just kind of knew, yeah. A couple of girls I dated, one girl for about 3 or 4 months, but it's overall, but she was the one that when we started talking, I didn't, the first time I introduced myself to her, I didn't ask her out that night. I just, that day I just spent some time with her, and we had meet for lunch or breakfast at the cafeteria, something like that, or I'd walk her to class or something. We just talked about things, and then I began to hear sort of her values and those kinds of things that I realized, this is someone I would like to pursue.
Yeah.
So.
That's good.
Okay. I have restarted the stream. I put it to start the event automatically, so it should pick up. Okay. We may not even know if we're live on YouTube until we're completely finished.
I'll go with
because I haven't quite figured out the YouTube platform yet, but that's why I'm doing this. So, for those just joining in, casual conversation with Dr. Denning before we get started on our interview. If you would, mysterious off-screen person, keep me posted on the time. We'll
3 minutes.
We'll roll right into the official show at 4 o'clock. But so you mentioned that you're running some half marathons. What is your ultimate goal?
Well, I want to stay in good shape, and I love to run. I've been running since I was in high school, and so this year's the first year I've run half marathons. I thought, I think I'm going to do something different this year. So there's a couple of ones that I want to run. Rock and Roll Half Marathon, I want to do that one.
Nice.
There's one called the 1775 that one of our classmates taught, who's also a military vet. So 17.75 K 11 mile race. It's the Marines. When the 1775 is when the Marines started. I really want to do that one. It's up in, I think, Washington next year. So some things like that I think would be a neat thing to do. So,
right.
But mostly it's just I enjoy running, and I just and this year I just decided I'm gonna see if I can run a half marathon. And so I've pretty much proven I can do that since I'm doing my 4th one a week from today. So, yeah.
I was the same way back when I first started running. It was like a marathon. How many miles? You're crazy. I'd never do that. And then this one lieutenant in my unit was like, "Hey, we're gonna run, and we're gonna build a team and do the inaugural Army Marathon from Killeen to Temple." And I was like, "All right." She was like, "Well, I wanted to invite you because I figured that you like to, because at the time I would run a lot, but I just ran to stay in shape. I ran because you had to for the Army. But she was like, I know you like to run, and I was like, how many miles is it?
Yeah.
In the inaugural, they only had the full marathon distance. They didn't have the second one. They did the half and the 5K as well for everyone else. So that was pretty exciting. All right, so our official timekeeper has let us know. Thank you very much. Greetings, everyone. Thank you so much for tuning in. I am here with Dr. Bill Denning as promised. Thank you so much for taking time out of your day.
Glad to do it.
And allowing us to host this in this gorgeous room that you have here. I know it's not a studio, but give me like 3 months. So basically what we're going to be talking about is just digging into Dr. Denning's head and seeing what all he's experienced. He's like 1 or 2 years older than me.
Yeah, a couple.
So he's been around the world and back and has a few things to tell us. And I have quite a few questions that both dig into a personal aspect of Dr. Denning's life, a business aspect, so we can get into that business entrepreneurial mindset, especially for those transitioning out of the military. And I just want to take this opportunity to extend a thank you to everyone who supported this channel and these videos up to this point, because we wouldn't have gotten here without the support. And thank you to Toya for helping us out off screen. Pretty much every single video or every single event that you see us do is successful because of what she puts into this. So thank you both. Thank you, everyone. I'm going to introduce myself real quick. I'm Ryan Smeltz. This is the Bearded Veteran, and the focus of this channel and the focus of what we're doing is assisting those who have made the decision to join the military and those transitioning from military to civilian life. There are many things I stumbled across, primarily because before I went into the military, I had absolutely no idea what to expect. I didn't know what I was getting myself into. And then transitioning out of the military, because we're seasoned that pretty much right time, right place, right uniform. That's the extent of what you have to do in the military. And I was really nervous about getting out. I had no idea where I was going or what I was doing. I'm still not too sure I do, you know. And so just lending that hand, lending the assistance, the information to other people who are in similar shoes is what's really important to me. And that's why I'm really excited to talk to you, because you're older than me, you like some of the same things I do, and you have this plethora of just knowledge and experience to offer. Plus, I asked and you said yes, so here we are. So now let's take a minute and find out who the man is behind the curtain. Dr. Denning, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Well, Ryan, first of all, I want to say how grateful I am for the opportunity to do this. I appreciate the invitation. I appreciate just the conversations we've had about using social media and about getting the word out. And I'm really excited to hear about what you're doing with this channel. I just think that's a neat thing. I'll tell you, maybe think of something. I never served in the military. There's a little story about that I'll share perhaps if we get a chance. But when I moved to Alexandria, Virginia, which I'll talk about a little later, I came in contact with lots of career military people, and I really developed such an appreciation. I always had an appreciation for patriotism and for the Army and or military, and just grateful for the service of men like you and women and others who are serving. But having that interaction with those folks really encouraged me in a very positive way in my thinking about that. And so I'm just grateful to know. I know that because I have friends who have been in the military, who have retired, who've moved on to other things, and I know some of the challenges because I've talked to them, and so I'm really grateful for what you're doing with this channel to try to help in that transition. I just think that's such an important thing, particularly because people are, sacrificing in so many ways to serve, and then to be able to help them make that transition. So first of all, let me just say thanks to you for that. A little bit about me. I am a campus dean at a local university here. Actually currently serving as for 2 campuses, only because they're in the process of trying to hire another dean. And that hasn't happened yet. Hopefully that will. I talked to my boss on Wednesday this week, and he had assured me that by early January we're going to have that happen. So I'm happy about that. I'm happy to serve, do what I'm doing. For many years, however, I was a pastor for 30 years, and we can talk more about that in detail. That was a great experience for me. It's like any other position you're in. I mean, there's good things and bad things, obviously, but overall it was a really good experience. When I transitioned away from that 5.5 years ago, it was a real deliberate decision, but one that I sort of sensed, if you will, a calling to do something different. I didn't know at that point it was going to be academics or higher education, although I kind of planned educationally to do higher ed. I just never had that opportunity until I got a call 5.5 years ago and came in as an adjunct and so forth, became associate campus dean, then full-time faculty, and then promoted to campus dean. So it's been a really good transition for me. My wife and I have been married for 33 years this past August. She is a saint to put up with me for all these years. We have 3 great boys. Our oldest is 30. As a matter of fact, he was born the day that I was to graduate with my master's degree, and I missed graduation because we were at the hospital having a baby.
Holy smokes.
So I still graduated, but I had to call the provost that morning at 8 o'clock and say I can't be there, and I'd already talked to him that week because we knew the baby was coming any day. Funny thing was when I was finishing my doctorate in 95, I was due to graduate in June of 95, and we had been thinking about having another baby. We had 2 boys, young boys at the time, and when we finally got pregnant, we went to the doctor and we discovered that the due date was the exact same day as my doctoral graduation. So I called the chairman of the doctoral program that I knew really well, and I said, I need to postpone for a year. He said, why is that? I said, well, you remember what happened when I had my first baby and I missed graduation? He said, yeah, I remember that. I said, I don't want to miss my doctorate graduation. So I postponed for a year, and it worked out great. Our youngest was a year old when I finished that degree in 96. So I have 3 great boys. Our middle son is 28. He is, all 3 boys are living here in Raleigh. My youngest son is 22. My oldest works in the restaurant industry. He's actually just this fall started back to school to finish his bachelor's degree with us. I'm really excited about that. My middle son has a music performance degree, a master's in music performance from Carnegie Mellon University. He plays with the Durham Symphony here in the area. But he also went back to school and got a computer certificate and is a programmer with an investment company here, a big, well-known investment company. Just celebrate his first year anniversary with them, so that's been kind of a cool thing. And then our youngest is finishing an Associates of Engineering and is headed over to NC State to their computer science program in about a year. So very cool. My wife is the only girl in the family. Even the boy, even the dog we have is a boy, so she's the queen here. So we really have a great time. Family's a real important thing for us, and it's a little bit about my history and family and so forth.
That's awesome. So a lot of education, more getting education, kind of follows suit, and she might be surrounded, but probably gets special treatment.
Yeah, she's the queen. That's true. Yeah,
that's phenomenal. Yeah. So Dr. Denning, I'm going to set some expectations with our audience for a moment, and that is we have someone off camera helping us out with the comments, and for those watching on YouTube, we're on Facebook. For those watching on Facebook, we're on YouTube Live as well. And of course, I'll put this together and produce a video to put up there for the informational purposes. This is something I don't want people to miss out on. And this opportunity right here is the chance that we have to ask you questions. And it being 2017, we have a direct line. So when someone has a question, go ahead, post it in the comments, shoot us a message on the Bearded Veteran, preferably on the Facebook page. YouTube is fine, we'll get to those as well. We have someone off camera who's helping us with the comments and the messages, so make sure you have a question of someone who has this type of experience, and this this type of knowledge. I mean, he's got a PhD, so I'm sure he can shed some light on many different situations, many different avenues. Someone transitioning from the military, just go ahead, post those in the comments, ask the questions. We're welcoming some audience interaction here, and I'm really excited about that. So it looks like we're having technical difficulties, but Dr. Denning, I'm sorry. So we covered a little bit about you and who you are. Let's talk about early life, okay? Mm-hmm. So you're from North Carolina.
Correct.
Tell us what it was like growing up in North Carolina.
Well, as you can tell, my accent is not northern by any means. So yeah, I grew up here in rural North Carolina, a little town of about 2,500 people. My dad and mom and my brother, sister, and I'm the oldest of three, moved from Tennessee here in 1964. And that was a real pivotal move for many reasons, but it's a small town. Everybody knew one another. I started school there, had a pretty normal, typical rural North Carolina childhood growing up. My dad was very entrepreneurial and very hardworking. I don't ever remember him sleeping past 5 or 5:30. He just was always up early. He was normally out and gone by the time I would get up, generally speaking. Some days not, but he was a great risk taker, and he was certainly willing to try things. He failed a lot, but he also succeeded a lot. When I was growing up, he had 7 businesses. When I was a teenager, everything from an insurance agency to a finance company to finance insurance premiums to a series of laundromats he owned, an antique store, a real estate company, just a variety of things. So I saw this kind of work ethic with my dad, which was inspiring to me, and I always wanted to be like him. Nice. Because I saw that kind of drive and determination. Funny story, when I wrestled in high school, I started my sophomore year. My freshman year, I was actually the scorekeeper for the wrestling team, and after watching the whole season, I decided I could wrestle, so I went out for the team the next year and made the team. Actually made first string. Of course, there was nobody in my weight class to wrestle against me, but I remember after my first meet that I lost. Obviously, I was just starting, and my dad always went to every wrestling match I had, and so I was riding home with he and my mom after the match, and my dad said, do you want me to help you with this? Well, my dad really didn't know much about wrestling, and so I wasn't quite sure what he was meaning by that, but having confidence and faith in him, I said, sure, what do you got? And he said, well, I got something in mind. He said, I guarantee this will help you, become a better wrestler. And I said, okay. So I agreed without really knowing what that meant. The next morning at 5 o'clock, my door opened to my bedroom, and my dad turned my light on and told me to get out of bed. We were going running. So that's when I started running. I wasn't so excited about his plan, but basically what he did was he helped me to get in the best shape possible. And honest to goodness, my senior year, I won some matches only because I was in better shape than my opponent. I mean, I knew by that point how to wrestle. I knew moves and all that kind of stuff. So I really credit my dad. And that kind of tells you a little bit about who he was and sort of the life that he lived in front of us. So it's pretty exciting to see that kind of inspiration and that kind of persistence and hard work. I mentioned about him being a risk taker. That was a big thing for him. He was just willing to do something. And if it failed, he never looked at failure as being a person. It was always an event. And as I shared in class, yesterday really did end last night. Failure is not a person, it's an event. And so I learned that, I saw that, because as I said, he made a lot of money, he lost a lot of money, he made a lot of money, he lost a lot of money. This is his life. I jokingly say if he just put a little of that money when he made it aside, he could have changed our whole family tree financially, but when I get to heaven, I'm going to talk to him about that too. But anyway, so I grew up in that kind of environment and really inspired by my dad and my mom, and just kind of seeing, what they did. That was an important thing. He was on the town board. He was mayor pro tempore in the little town that we lived in. So he was known by everybody. So my brother and sister and I could not get away with anything in town because somebody would call my dad and let him know, since everybody knew him. So that's a little bit of my history. I moved away from that town in 1977. I still consider it to be my hometown. If anybody asks me, that's where I'm from. But I haven't lived there since 77, so I've been gone for a long time.
Okay.
It's a great place. I think it's still about 2,500 people, last I heard, so it's not changed a whole lot.
What was the name of the town again?
Benson.
Oh, right.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's awesome. I got friends down in that area. That's pretty cool.
Yeah.
So that's growing up, living in Johnston County. Something that you had mentioned to me before in class, which was intriguing, and the story was pretty exciting, was this radio show that you used to do. Tell us about this radio show.
Okay. So I need to back up and tell you a little bit of the story prior to that. So I went to college when I graduated high school in 1976. I went for 3 semesters. I was not a bad student, was a B student. I just didn't know what I wanted to do. And I think part of that came because I saw my dad doing so many different things. And I sort of wanted to be like him. So I wasn't just sure what I wanted to do. So after my 3rd semester, I dropped out of school. My dad and I bought a Christmas tree farm up in the mountains of Virginia, a place called Newcastle, Virginia, Craig County. Ran that farm for a couple of years. We sold that. I decided to go back to school, finished my bachelor's degree. And so about 2 months before I graduated, and I graduated December of 82, in October I was invited to speak at a little church. I had become a Christian at age 16, and so I kind of sensed that I was supposed to do something ministry related, although I never really sensed that I was supposed to be a pastor all my life, although I mentioned that for 30 years that's what I did. But anyway, I went to this little church, and it was about 30 people. The youngest person besides me, and I was 26 at the time, 25 maybe, was a little 12-year-old girl. There was nobody else any younger than that there. So it was a bunch of wonderful people, but a lot of gray hair, and nothing wrong with gray hair, obviously. But the little church began to grow. In the first 3 or 4 years that we were there, we saw some growth, and ultimately grew about 5 times the size it was. So we were averaging about 30 when I went there, and averaged 166 when we left, about 7 years later. But during that time, I felt like we wanted to have an impact in the community. So I went to a local radio station, a little AM station there, actually in Benson, the station there, and set up to do a radio like Bible study thing on Saturdays. And so I had a little studio set up in my church office. I would record this Bible study, and then I would literally put it on a cassette tape. This was back in the mid-'80s. Cassette tape, take it over, physically drop it off at the radio station on Fridays, and they would play it at noon on Saturday. And we first set that up. We actually talked about a phone number you can call if you've got questions or you got needs, and we could pray with you, whatever. And I had enlisted a group of people from church, and they were kind of manning the phones, and we just didn't get many calls. I think, if I remember correctly, we got maybe 1 or 2 over the first month that we did the show. So it was not something that we needed to continue to do as far as that. So we stopped, the phone kind of thing. So I really didn't know how many people were listening to the show. I just didn't know that. And this is, of course, way back before you could go to Google. There was no internet or Google or anything back in those days. Well, maybe there was an internet in '85, but it was not something like that today. So I just didn't know. I guess I could have talked with the manager of the station, the owner of the station, find out. But when I left there in 1990 to move to a senior pastor position up in Alexandria, Virginia, I decided not to continue the show, and basically because of the logistics of it. I'd have a cassette tape. I'd end up having to, mail to them. It just wasn't going to work. I was too far away. So when I went and talked to the guy at the radio station, he was just so insistent. Please, you can't stop this. We've got people. We hear about this. People watch or listen to the show, and but it was not something I could continue. fast forward to last December of 2016. I was actually back in Benson at a wake for a man that I've known all my life who had passed away. I was standing in a very long line of people waiting to visit with the family for a moment. And a guy comes into the line, stands right behind me, he and his wife. I've known this guy all my life, and we were chatting about a number of things, and he asked me, he said, "Do you remember that radio show?" I said, "Yeah, man, it's 30 years ago." He said, "I used to listen to that every Saturday." So it's funny that even 30 years later, I had someone mention that program to me. So that's a little bit about that show.
That's awesome. I just like the part where it's like 30 years full circle, you know.
Yeah, it's kind of funny, you know.
You listen to that?
Yeah, that's true. That's true.
So, little expectation versus reality. You think no one's listening, and
yep,
someone's listening. That's pretty awesome. I'll pause real quick to see if we have any questions from the audience just yet.
Not just yet, but we have a lot of people tuning in.
Okay, awesome. So I want you guys, so if you're just tuning in right now, we do have it on YouTube and we do have it on Facebook. So this is Dr. Denning. So we'll get to see his introduction once I put the whole video together again. He's the campus dean. He's told us quite a bit about himself, what's really important, which essentially sums up in one word, and that's family. And he's got quite a bit of experience and quite a bit of knowledge. So if you have questions or you want to take this opportunity just to say something or ask a question, make sure you do so, because we're live right now. So this is the key moment for you to ask questions, and we have someone off screen, which we just heard from. She'll let us know if we've got questions or anything like that, and I'm sure Dr. Denning would be happy to answer those questions.
Absolutely.
So we talked about your radio show, which I also like because I'm a technology guy. So as much as I love what we're able to do here and able to do right now, I know it stemmed from somewhere as well. And just like I talked about that old camera from the tripod I had, you were doing cassette tapes,
Yep.
to take to a radio station.
Yep.
So that's, once again, years before that, you wouldn't have been able to do that. And in 1985, you were
Yep.
able to pull that off. So
Yep.
that was pretty amazing. Some of the questions that I have before we start getting to the ones from the audience, what you talked about your dad a little bit, and you talked about some of the business ventures he had and how you played into that with the Christmas tree farm. But just in general, because when I think about my childhood, I think about where mom and dad took us and what we did and how we got punished when we did something bad, or playing with my siblings. So like, what were your parents like growing up, and what part of that contributes to how you are now as a father and a husband?
Great question. A couple of things come to my mind. My dad was a pretty strong disciplinarian, and probably wouldn't be surprised to hear that just with his background. I mean, he's kind of a no-nonsense guy. Never questioned my mom and dad's love for me at all. Never had a question about that. So dad and mom were, family was an important piece for us. And we did a lot of things together. So because he had different businesses and made good money, we had a place at the beach at Topsail Island. As a matter of fact, we had one of the first beach cottages at the end of the island, south end of the island, when there's some canals down there. I think ours was the third cottage built down there. So we kind of jokingly said at times, wonder where the beach cottage is this year, because he seemed to always buy and sell those. That's part of his real estate stuff, I guess he did. So we spent a lot of weekends at the beach and did a lot of family stuff. I remember when I was 15 and my brother was 14, my dad had a Wellcraft, 16-foot Wellcraft tri-hull with a Chrysler 70 motor on it. He liked to go out and fish out in the ocean, and he determined that was not a big enough boat. So he gave that boat to my brother and me and bought himself a 22-foot boat of some sort. I don't even remember what that was. I mean, we couldn't even drive a car to pull the thing to put it in the water. So we actually invited a friend of ours who's a year older than me on many weekends to come with us to the beach so we could actually get the boat in the water. So But we spent a lot of time doing those kinds of things. Another thing that we did a lot of hunting. You grew up in rural North Carolina, it's a big thing. So every year at Labor Day, dove hunting was a big deal in our family. So all the guys got together at some uncle's house somewhere, and I don't know what all the women did. They didn't go with us, but we'd always have a place scoped out and have permission to go, and we'd take I can remember going hunting when I was so small I didn't even get to carry a gun. I just would be able to go retrieve the birds or whatever, so. But it was an important thing, that connection with family, even extended family like that. We had a place in the mountains for a number of years. And so a lot of times we would go there, and we'd go to the beach during the summer and the mountains in the winter. But it was still family. And my mom and dad always had this sort of open environment at our house. Most every single night we would have someone that wasn't a part of our family have dinner with us. It was almost like sort of a given. You would have someone show up, maybe a friend of my sister's or one of my friends or my brothers or whatever, or maybe two people, and there was always enough food, and we'd always make place at the table, and that's the kind of the sort of family life that we had, a real connectedness. I'll tell you another story. My dad, I mentioned, had done very well financially. I had a friend of mine that for several years, he was my best friend. He had a older sister, wanted to go to college, and my dad paid her way 4 years to college. That was long before I could go, but that's just the kind of generosity that he had, and that was a great example for me personally. There were times when we would have an opportunity, or he would have an opportunity to help with someone's, home heating bill or something like that. And he never wanted to get credit for that. So I remember one guy that was a dear friend of ours, owned a little home heating company, home heating oil company. And Dad would just call him up and say, "Do you have some families that are having trouble?" And he would say, "Yeah, I got these 5 families." And Dad said, "Just send me their bill and I'll pay for it. I don't want them to know who's done it." So that's the kind of family life that we had. My dad I mentioned about being a disciplinarian. He was also it was kind of interesting. He was very creative. This was sort of this entrepreneurial sort of mindset I think he had. Matter of fact, just a week or so ago at Thanksgiving, my brother and I, had our families together, my sister and her family, and we were reminiscing about some of the disciplines that my dad would do. And so just to give you an example, one of the things is if he wanted to discipline us, he'd have us write sentences. And part of that was he wanted us to learn English, and so I can remember one time he would always dictate the sentence that you had to write. And one time he dictated this sentence to me that was so long it took a half a page to write it. He told me to write 100 of them. I got 17 done, and he relented and let me slide. So, but another time, and my brother and I were laughing about this just the other day, talking about this. We were in the front yard of our house playing football with some friends, neighborhood friends, and as brothers will often do, we got in a fight about something. I don't know. I never had but one fight in my entire life, except my brother. I fought him many times. But my dad comes out of the house. I don't know how he knew we were fighting. I had no idea. But I can remember it like it was yesterday. He came and he stood on the steps and he called us by our first names. And he always had this certain tone he used when you were in trouble. I can't mimic it at all, but I could hear it in my head. And the moment he called our names, Bill, Richard, and he said that, my brother and I stopped fighting, and we were rolling around on the ground. We stopped fighting and looked up, and he said, "Get up here right now." And we stood there on the steps, and he just was very quiet and calm. And all the boys were behind us that we were playing football with. And, they didn't know what Mr. Pete was going to do. And he just looked at us for a moment, and it's just sort of this pregnant pause, like, okay, let's get it over with. And finally he says, "I want you to hold hands, and I want you to run around the house 10 times. Now that sounds kind of weird, except every time we came back around the house with all those boys, man, did we hear it from them about, "You're holding hands, and what's going, I don't know whether he coached them on what to do when we came back around or not. He probably did, but he was very creative. with that kind of thing, you know. So I grew up in that sort of environment, you know. It was a good environment, very, you know, a good home, a good experience overall.
That's awesome. I can. Some of the things you just talked about reminds me of the military. In the military, you run into a lot of creative leaders as well. One time you might be getting punished one way for something, and you do something different, and the next time you're dealing with a different leader who's more creative, and you're dealing with something else. So it kind of reminded me of that. I think we have a question or some input from the audience. And
we have a question.
I'd love to hear what that
So
is.
we have a question from Talia, and she says, how did you find out what career would be best for you, and what advice would you give young adults in college trying to figure it out?
Wow, that is a great question, and it's one that I have heard many times. So there are a couple of things that come to my mind. One is I think it's important to sort of understand how you are wired. Let me see if I can illustrate this. I am, as you've probably already, you know this already, but they've probably figured this out already. I'm a talker. I mean, I could just get up in front of people, and so much of my career I've done that. So if I were in a job that would require me to look at a computer screen 8 hours a day and have no interaction with anybody else, I would just go bonkers. I mean, I couldn't do that. As a matter of fact, even in my current role, there are times when I have to really be focused on something, but I've learned that I set myself up goals, and then when I accomplish that goal, I go talk to someone, because that's the way I get energized. So first of all, figuring out how you are wired, and there are a lot of great tools out there to do that. In our class, we did a temperament survey early on in our class. The temperament survey is one you can find online. It's doer, influencer, relator, thinker. There's a couple of other versions of it, but that's the one I saw 35 years ago, and I've used that many, many times. So doing something like that, there are ways that you can figure out sort of how you are wired. That's the first thing, I think, because that helps you to understand. Some roles are not going to be a good fit because they just don't. It's like trying to put a square peg in a round hole. It just doesn't fit very well. My wife, on the other hand, I'm kind of the doer-influencer style. My wife is more the thinker-relator style. Now, she is a senior product QA analyst. That means it's a big term to mean she does testing with software. It's more than that, but that's a big piece of what she does. So she can sit at a computer screen testing software for hours at a time and not go bonkers, where I couldn't do that. You know, she gets energized by being alone and quiet. I get energized by being around people. So if you're looking at roles, figure that out. That's one of the key things. Another thing, and this may sound kind of odd, but try things. You know, go volunteer. Look at options and opportunities. When I became an adjunct professor, I got paid, obviously, to teach that class. I didn't get paid to come to campus any other time. I got paid when I came and taught that class, and it was a set salary. This is what you get paid for this class. But I came every time we had some kind of student event. I would show up. We had a full-time faculty meeting every week on Tuesday. I was not full-time faculty. I only missed one of those meetings in 2 years, and that's because I was sick that day. I decided I wanted to check this thing out, and I thought the best way to do that is to jump into it and see, you know, if I do that. So testing things, testing the waters a little bit, going and volunteering, finding something that you're interested in. I would never quit something until you have something really in place. I mean, I see people do that. They've got a hobby and they really want to take it full time. Nothing wrong with taking a hobby full time, but you really need to get it to the point where you can be sustained by that before you quit what you're doing. So sometimes people make mistakes like that, and then they think, well, this is not what I need to do. And it may be that's just the stress and pressure of finances, and those kinds of things keep them from doing that. So understanding who you are, your temperament, your personality, testing the waters a little bit. There are also some really good resources online that you can go in. and actually complete surveys, and they give you ideas about different kinds of fields that are interesting, that you might be interested in, that might fit who you are. I think in my case, and I mentioned earlier about being a pastor, so I'll tell you a little bit about that part of my history. So I really felt that God was calling me to do some kind of ministry, but I never, as a matter of fact, I've said this for 35 years, I never believed God said, I want you to be a pastor the rest of your life. Now, my father-in-law is a pastor. He's 83 years old. He just announced his retirement. He's been pastoring since he was 19. He's got more energy than really I got, to be honest with you. I mean, it's crazy. He is really a pastor. I mean, that is really who he is, okay? For me, I believe you can do ministry in a lot of different ways. I think about that, helping people, encouraging people. And so when I became a pastor, it was a real clear kind of direction. This is what I was supposed to do. I kind of knew that. The 3 churches that I pastored in 30 years, I never did move around very much. It was really clear that I knew this is where I was supposed to go. How did I know that? I'm not 100% sure that I could give you an answer on that. But I knew that part of it had to do with my personality. I felt good. I like leading people. I like encouraging people. I saw that as a way to do that, and that was a part of that process. So those are the things that come to my mind immediately.
That's awesome. I believe some of what you just talked about correlates strongly with a speaker I heard in Atlanta. His name's David Rendall. He actually lives in Goldsboro here in North Carolina. He wrote a book. His main topic, I believe the name of his book is Freak Factor. He basically talks about embracing your weakness to create a strength. And something that he said while he was talking to the entire group was, my entire life I was told to sit down, shut up, and do what I was told, and now I get paid to stand up, talk, and do what I'm not told to do.
Right.
So that kind of, figuring out how I'm wired and trying new things is definitely an excellent way to help channel all those things.
So, another thing that comes to mind and sort of relates to this is finding out what you're passionate about. If there's something that you really love to do. Jenny and I were watching. We watched the show Shark Tank
Nice.
pretty regularly. I just find it a pretty entertaining show, but it's always encouraging to see what people are coming up with. But they did this little promo thing last night. We saw it. I think it was a previously recorded version because President Obama was still in office, so it was at some point during his administration with a Shark Tank. 3 of the sharks went to the White House, and they had some Army veterans that they were talking about how to move them from being in the military to the civilian life, and which is kind of interesting in our conversation today. But one of the sharks, I don't remember, it was Robert Herjavec, I think it was him. I may be wrong about that, but he said, find something that you're really passionate about and go out and try to meet that need. Don't worry about the money. Don't worry about the job. Go out and meet that need. The money and stuff, if it's really a need out there, it will come. He said people, and he made a comment, he said people get it backwards. They go out and they're looking for the money and not for whatever it is they're really trying to help someone with. I thought that was really good advice because I'm kind of interested in, as you and I have talked, I'm kind of interested in doing something in social media myself. And I even said to you, it's not really about, I'm grateful for the job I have and the income I have, but I'd love to be able to do that just because I'm passionate about being able to do that and meet those kinds of needs.
Absolutely. I like that. Do we have any other questions from the audience?
Not at the moment.
Okay, perfect. So I got a couple more written down here, but you just touched on something else I want to talk about. And I hope I'm not jumping ahead of myself, but you talked about getting into the social media and meeting the need. So what I want you to talk about, because I've already heard this, what I want you to talk about is that need and what you mentioned your passion is with helping other people take responsibility.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So several years ago, I read a book by John G. Miller called The QBQ, The Question Behind the Question. And his whole focus is on personal responsibility. And I really resonated with that book. Resonated with it for a number of reasons, not just because of what he said in the book, that was a part of it, but because of the long history I've had prior to that and the books I've read and the things that I have done. And one of the things that I've really become passionate about is helping people accept responsibility. I see so many people today that it's always someone else's fault. Now, I realize that there are times, I've experienced this, we all have, when people have done things to us that we didn't deserve to have happen to us. I get that. I realize that's a part of life. I've had that. Everybody has had that. I can't control that. What I can control, however, is my response to that. So there's a little phrase that I saw not too long ago, so it's not unique to me, but it says there's a space between stimulus and response, and that space is called choice. So I really believe that we get to choose. We get to choose our attitude. We get to choose our response. If someone cuts me off in traffic, I can run them down. I can yell and scream. I get to choose to do that, or I can choose not to do that. It really is my choice. And so sometimes I find myself helping people clarify the situation. Sometimes I'll have students come to me with issues, and I'll listen. That's a part of helping them clarify, is really listen to try to understand what's going on. But sometimes after listening to that, I'll realize there's really only 3 options here. We can talk about this till next week, but there are really only 3 options, and this is the way it works. And I can remember a couple of students that I've talked to who I've said, I hear what you're saying, I get it, I resonate with it, I feel the same way. So let's talk about what your options are. Option 1 is this, option 2 is this, option 3 is this. If there's a 4th, then I'll tell them. Sometimes I'll have students that will say, yeah, I hear that, and then they'll start rehashing the story again. That's perfectly okay, I get that. But then I'll always come back to say, well, I hear what you're saying, but you really got 3 options. Option 1 is this. And part of what I think my role and part of what I'm passionate about is help people be able to see that. Sometimes people get, and I've had people come to me who are just so almost emotionally worked up that they can't even think straight anymore. And sometimes just listening and having a calming voice and helping them to actually look at the situation maybe from a little different angle helps them clarify that. So that's a real passion for me. And I'd like to be able to do something like that. You and I have talked about this. I have another friend who does a lot with social media. He and I have talked a couple times, and I think, honest to goodness, I think it's just a matter of just doing it. It's just a matter of doing it. And I'm not perfect by any means, and so I think I'm like a lot of other people, and I see something I really want to do, and it's like, okay, I need to do that, yeah. Okay, I need to do that, yeah. Okay, I need to do that, yeah. And sometimes you just got to say, okay, I'm going to do it. Starting today, I'm going to do this. And for me, I think that's kind of where I am at this point. What that will look like, I'm not completely sure. I am working on a book, and I think I mentioned to you at some point. I don't know exactly when that'll be done, but I've been writing on that. I kind of go in spurts, but I probably need to do that every single day. Write a page or 2 every single day. Or record something every single day.
Absolutely.
So,
but
awesome. That is a real passion for me. Is I want to encourage people. Mm-hmm. And sometimes the most encouraging thing you can do is to help a person see clearly their situation.
Yeah.
I remember a story. I worked for a company in sales. I've always done sales. As a matter of fact, I put myself through college doing sales. I can tell you something about this. Kind of an interesting story there. But I was working for this company. I was doing nothing but sales. And one of the project managers was not really doing his job. I'll be honest, he just wasn't. And he got fired, and rightly so. I completely supported his firing. Guy was not doing what he ought to do. In a conversation after the firing with the vice president of sales for the company, I made a statement that I felt sorry, and what I was going to say was I felt sorry for his family, who now is experiencing some difficulty because he got fired, obviously. Before I could say, I felt sorry for his family. I just said I feel sorry. What I actually was going to say, I feel sorry for him and his family. Before I could get and his family out, the guy cut me off and he said, you should never feel sorry for someone who got what they deserve. Because sometimes the best thing in the world is to help a person see clearly their situation. He might never change had he not gone through this. Well, I wasn't really too concerned about him, quite honestly. I was really concerned more about his family, so I probably could have rephrased that better. But I kind of find myself doing that. It's helping people sometimes see clearly those situations. Sometimes seeing clearly is not a pleasant picture to see. That's the point I'm making. Sometimes it's a hard thing to see, but it's the best thing overall for a person.
Absolutely. That's phenomenal. And I completely agree with you when it comes to writing books and putting up content. One of the best things I've learned, and that I talked about this earlier, so this might be a repeat for some of our audience, but I was live earlier today and I was talking about a video I saw by Gary Vaynerchuk.
Oh yeah, Gary V. I like it.
He does the Ask Gary V and the Daily V.
Yep.
He has dipped into and apparently does a lot of content on Facebook Watch, which is essentially the equivalent of the YouTube TV, which is pretty exciting. And in one of his videos, he does a lot of social media focus. And one of the things he talks about when it comes to social media, when it comes to putting things like that out, is just put the content up.
Yep.
Put up quality content that people care about listening to or watching, and everything else will fall into place, which essentially piggybacks off of what you were talking about earlier. Don't go looking for the money, fill a need. That's awesome. And I look forward to seeing some of those videos. So.
Yeah, I'm going to have to do that. I've got the equipment to do it. It's just a matter of disciplining myself to do it. So.
Absolutely. So, right here, one of my next questions, I said, what lessons did you learn as an adult from your childhood? So essentially what I'm talking about here is you talked a little bit about what you did as a young adult and how you got into the different fields that you're involved in. You talked about your childhood and what that was like, and your father being disciplinary and very creative with it. What I really want to ask here is essentially hindsight being 2020, everything coming full circle. I wish I knew that before, or if I knew then what I know now. What are some of those things that you've run into?
Great question. So a couple things come to mind. One is, regardless of where you are, put money aside for retirement, and more than you think you should, because you will need it. Not that I'm going to retire next year or anything like that. I'm at a point where I won't work for several more years. But just looking at that, for many years my wife was a stay-home mom with our boys. When our youngest finally went off and was in middle school, that's when she got her first part-time job, and now she works full-time. So we're trying to catch up on some of that. So we made conscious decisions and conscious choices, and I'm not upset about that at all. But I wish now that I had known some of those things. I wish I had done a 15-year mortgage instead of a 30-year mortgage, and disciplined myself to do that when I moved to Alexandria. I probably could have. I was there for 10 and a half years, so I'd have that house almost paid off. So that's the first thing is just plain and simple, for retirement, put more money aside than you think that you can and that you think that you will need, because you will need it. I can just tell you at my age it's true. And so to me that's an important piece, just looking long term. I'll be honest with you, right? Up until about 4 or 5 years ago, I never thought about retirement. When you're 30, you don't think about retirement. You just don't. I swear you don't. You just don't. When you get to be 59, you start thinking about retirement, and you think, oh my Lord, look at my retirement account, I should have put more money there. So that's the first thing. The other thing is it has to do with decisions that you make. So let me see if I can illustrate this. So let's suppose you are facing a big decision, and given there are times we all make dumb decisions. We don't think through things. We don't invest the time. We don't do the background stuff. We don't do our due diligence. I get that. We all make those decisions, and those are ones we can kick ourselves down the road. I get that. But I'm talking about the ones that we've really made the effort to understand, okay? and we've done the research, we've talked to people, we've figured this out, and we've decided, okay, this is the decision I'm going to make. And it turns out to be a wrong decision. You can obviously do all the research, have all the data, everything you need, and then discover that it's not a good decision. I understand. What we don't want to do, though, is 15 years down the road, when you realize it was a bad decision, or 5 years down the road, or a year down the road, the only reason you know it was a bad decision is because you have more information than you did when you made the decision. So I find people who will beat themselves up because of some decision they made. When they did all their due diligence, they did the research, they did everything they needed to do to make that right decision. But now they realize it's a wrong decision. But the only reason they know now it's a wrong decision is because they got more information. But they're beating themselves up about a decision they made when they made that decision with all the information they could possibly have at that point. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
I cannot tell you the number of people that I've talked to who live in this past. They're thinking about, why did I do that? Or I made this, I did that, or I did this. And the only reason they're feeling that way is because they got new information that they didn't have. Now, you feel free to feel that way if you made a stupid decision, and we have all made those. I mean, I've made my share of those where we didn't do our due diligence. You can beat yourself up about those, and you probably should, and learn from it, But I'm talking about those where we've really done the hard work, and it turns out to be a wrong decision. And the only reason we know it's a wrong decision is because we got more data and more information. And sometimes that's a year, sometimes it's 5 years. I've talked to people who made a decision 20 years earlier, and they discovered, whatever came along their way, this was a dumb decision. And they're just beating themselves up. Why did I do that? And you just can't do that. You just can't do it. You made the decision with the information you had at the time. If you're going to beat yourself up on those decisions, be those dumb decisions that you made, that we've all done. So those are the two things that immediately, come to my mind as I think back. I think I probably would be a little more assertive at times. Part of my personality as an influencer, I want to influence people, so sometimes I'm cautious about what I say, when I say it, and how I say it, and where I say it, and that can be wise. I understand, but there are times I've looked back in my life and think I really needed to have said something to this person to really address whatever the issue is, and I don't have something specific in mind. Yeah. I'll tell you, as you get a little older, you know the old grandma who's 85 years old that has no filter anymore. Yeah. You met those. Yeah. As you get older, that is true. I can tell you, when I was 30, I had much more of a filter than I do, in my 59th year. I can tell you that. As a matter of fact, sometimes my wife will say to me, you need to chill out a little bit here, kind of thing. Not that I'm really overbearing, but the point is, I probably would be a little more assertive looking back. I think I played into my own personality, and I understand that. I'm not upset about that, but I think if knowing what I do now, I probably would be a little more assertive at times.
That's awesome. Learning what we can do different. I'm the same way, just based off of some of the things that I've learned and a few things you just talked about, putting money back for retirement. Those are conversations I feel I held too late. Mm-hmm. And it's so funny because we're all different ages, and we still sometimes learn that lesson at a different point in our life. Yeah. And I'm like, I learned the lesson too late. But after listening to my financial advisor and reading, I read Tony Robbins' Money Master the Game, mm-hmm. which is probably about that thick.
Right.
I do the Audible. Yep. After going through that and listening to his 7 steps and taking a look at what I have, I completely agree with that. Putting more back than you expect, because you're gonna need it. Yeah. And not beating yourself up. I feel I see some of those same people sometimes, and I was laughing when you first started talking about that, not beating yourself up based off the decisions you make, because I was thinking of some of the ones that I've made in the past. and it's the same thing, you know. Especially on the ones where we do the research.
Yeah.
Those people, you know, you carrying that with you sometimes it might hold you back.
Yeah.
But that's phenomenal. So, do we have any more questions from the audience?
Not at the moment.
I didn't see my cue, so I just want to check in real quick. So, once again, we're talking quite a while here. I've got a little bit more to get through, but I want to bring everybody up to speed. If you're just joining in, it looks like we're not live on YouTube anymore. I'm going to put the recording together, but we are still live on Facebook, both on my personal page and the Bearded Veteran. And for those just joining in, this is Dr. Denning. He's letting us in on some insight into who he is, how he thinks, some of the things he's experienced, and the different knowledge he has. So I want you guys to take advantage of this time while we're live and go ahead and ask him those questions. He's deeply involved in a lot of education, more specifically the higher education, because he is the dean of 2 college campuses right now. So keep that in mind. If you're someone who's transitioning from the military, he can give us some insight into both the working environment of civilian life as well as the educational environment. So take advantage of this time. Ask those questions. I have somebody off screen that's going to help facilitate with that. Dr. Denning, the next question I want to get into here is, I think this might be a little bit more fun for you. What type of extracurricular activities are you involved in? And please feel free to elaborate.
Sure. Well, there's 2 things that really, other than family, which I mentioned earlier, is a big thing. We spend a great deal of time with family. I'm a runner. I mentioned that I started running when I was in high school when my dad put that bedroom light on at 5 o'clock in the morning. And so there were times during the 90s I spent a lot of time in the gym and on the treadmill and that kind of thing. But over the last several years, I've done a lot of running outside. That is a real stress reliever for me. I did 9.5 miles this morning, as a matter of fact. And I got my next half marathons next Saturday, and I'll be doing. So that's just it's a fun thing for me, and I enjoy doing that. I like that. It's just it really kind of clears my mind. So that's just a fun thing. My wife is also a runner, although she's not been training as much as I have. She did run my first half marathon this year. It was the first time I'd ever done one. I've done a lot of 5Ks and stuff over the years, but she did run with me, and she ran at my pace. She's faster than me, so although when we run together, she always has to be ahead of me, so she likes to lead the way. But she did run with me on that, so I've been enjoyed. She ran with me today. She did 5.5 and then cut back to the house because she had some stuff she needed to do, and I went ahead and finished another 4. But so that's really one of the main things that I do. Back a couple of months ago, we went through a time, you mentioned about kind of serving 2 campuses. I had 20 straight days that I worked without a day off, which is not good, and I'm not advocating that, but it's what I had to do. Even during that 20-day period, I went running because I knew I had to have that break. So that is some priority for me. The other thing is I use a lot of Audible books. You mentioned that a moment ago. I do a lot of reading. So when I'm running, I'll always be listening to a book. Sometimes I listen to music, but most of the time I listen to a book. If I'm in the car, almost always I've got a book on. My wife and I will get a book together, and we'll actually either, if we get an Audible book, we'll listen to it together, or if we get a hard copy, we'll read it together. We like to do that, so sometimes we'll have debates and discussions. She just recently came up with a suggested title of a Timothy Keller called The Reason for God. And our class that we're taking is a logic class, and this guy uses logic and reason to challenge belief and unbelief. It's a cool book. I mean, it really is. As a matter of fact, I read the first chapter, and I liked the first chapter so much and liked his arguments because he's very logical. I reread the first chapter. My wife asked me, how much have you read? And I said, well, I've only got the first chapter now. She said, why only first? I said, well, the reality is I like the first chapter so much I went back and reread it. So that's another thing that I do. And I really enjoy that. As we've talked in class, that I'm a Washington Redskins fan. Sorry, any Dallas fans who may be watching or any Giants fans. But grew up here in North Carolina, and back in the 70s when I was growing up, late 60s and early 70s, Redskins were always on TV, and I just grew up watching them every Sunday. And so I lived in Alexandria, Virginia for 10 years during the 90s, and so I went to 4 or 5 games a year there. And so I've always enjoyed that. Matter of fact, Thanksgiving Day, one of my sons, my 28-year-old, and I went to Washington and saw the game with the Giants. That's a lot of fun. So even Thursday night of our class, the Cowboys beat the Redskins. I hate to say that, but they did. I got home and my son was here watching the game. So we watch the games together. If it happens to not be sometimes it's on a channel that I don't get here with my package here, TV package, we'll go to a sports bar or something like that and watch it. So that's an important thing. And then another thing, I just like hanging out with my wife, to be honest with you. I mean, I just really do. We enjoy just doing things together. A couple of Saturdays ago, we went to a local store here, and I moved to another campus. As you know, I'm still serving the 2 campuses, but I wanted to get a little gift for everybody on the staff there, just to say thank you for welcoming me here, and a little Christmas kind of thing. And so I had a blast. I mean, she and I were in the same store. We were kind of doing our own thing, and it was a lot of fun. But I finished way earlier than she did. So I went next door to Best Buy and looked at some MacBook Pros and did some stuff in there a little while. But we just, in general, like hanging out with one another. We enjoy doing that. There's a couple of shows. We don't watch a whole lot of TV, but there's a couple of shows. There's a Great Britain baking show or something. Do you like that show? Yeah, we watched that. We're in like season 2 now. So that's something to almost every night, you know, not every single night, but many nights we climb into bed and turn Netflix on and watch that show. And so we just like, you know, those are the kinds of things that I enjoy doing. Everybody needs a little break from, you know, what you're doing, you know, work-wise, vocationally, and needs that kind of thing. So that's sort of, you know, what I do.
That's really cool. So just a little side note there: if you can eat it when you're finished making it, that's what she likes so much. Yeah, that's why that's why we got that bright glow. You mentioned before too, because I know you run. I remember in class on one of the first days, if not the very first day, you talked about one of the things I like to do for fun is hang out with my wife. Mm-hmm. So that doesn't surprise me, at least even in the slightest. But I believe you also said you play guitar.
I do. Yeah, I started playing in the 8th grade. I got a little electric guitar and a little amp for Christmas that year. And I actually sang in a talent show at the end of the school year. I sang the Staples Singers song, "I'll Take You There." I don't know whether anybody remembers that song or not. I don't know why in the world I did that. But anyway, that was one of those decisions I didn't think through very well, apparently. But yeah, then I got an acoustic guitar a few years later. And I haven't picked up the guitar much in the last year or so. It's just the running and the other things that I've been doing. But for many years, I played in the band at church. So we had, about 20 years I played in a band at church. And that was an outlet, which was really kind of a cool thing. So my wife is more classically trained than I am, and my son, my 28-year-old son, is, you know, he has a Master's of Music Performance from Carnegie Mellon, and he plays with the Durham Symphony. So he knows a lot more, but I do enjoy that. Yeah.
I do all tabs, so I knew how to read music. I paused when I was 11. Mom and Dad said, "Well, you gave up, so we're not going to pay for it anymore." So I had to relearn myself. And by that time, the internet was a real thing. So I was like, I wonder, you don't even need sheet music. You can just do it this way. Yeah. And now I do by ear or tabs. But I think we have a question from the audience.
We do.
Good.
I think it's really resonating with people that you're a campus dean and professor, because we have a lot of collegiate students kind of chiming in.
Awesome.
So, this is from Janetta, and she says, what advice would you give to college students who are having difficulty finding a career path after college?
That is such a tough thing. It really is, because so many people in our day are looking for something, and it's just sometimes the opportunities are just somewhat limited. So if someone's after school, that's a little different question than someone's beginning school. So let me start with the beginning school piece. I really think it's important to try to find, if you're going to do higher ed, to do something that the market there's some availability in that market. So I did a religion and philosophy degree in college. Looking back on that, I don't regret doing that, because part of the reason I'm able to do what I'm doing now is because of that degree. But in thinking about that, I probably would have been a little more practical in the subject that I chose or the major that I chose. So that's the thing. If you've already finished the degree, again, I go back to talk about trying to figure out, sort of what your passion is, what your temperament is, your personality is. Something my wife has done, which I thought was really good, is that now she has an English degree, so this is kind of interesting. She has an English degree, English and religion, as a matter of fact. And so I mentioned earlier, she's a senior product QA analyst. So how did where she go from English to that? Well, it has a lot to do with her temperament, which we talked about a little earlier, because she has this sort of thinker temperament. And a thinker is one who is always asking questions. Well, that's what a product QA analyst does. They're always asking questions. Why does this do this? Should this do this? Why is this not working? Let me go to the developer. So this is her. It really fits her temperament and personality. And so, I see, that kind of thing. So how did she get into that field? Well, she started out part-time, and it has a lot to do with connections. I'm really convinced. She is in the field that she is today, and has excelled in that field. I mean, really has. But she got in that industry because she knew someone in that industry. So one of the things I tell students, it really is important to network. So if I have a student who is a health services administration student, there are many organizations you can connect with in that field. If you're in the financial field, we talked about that a little earlier, there are all kinds of organizations you can connect to. If you're doing human resource management, SHRM is a big organization. Sometimes connecting with people in those fields, you get to know them, develop relationships, develop trust, and all of a sudden, John over here hears about an opening in Mary's company, who Mary's a friend, and he says, oh, I think about Ray over here that I know because we go to this group together, and Ray would be a perfect fit. So that is a key thing, I think, in doing that, is really networking. I don't think people do that as much as they should. I'm not saying don't rely on your degree. You need the degree. I mean, I could not do what I'm doing without the degrees I have. No question about that. But I also realize that there's a lot of networking that goes on. Let me illustrate out of my own life. So I mentioned I was a pastor down in Harnett County during the 80s. So from 83 until 1990. And then I moved to Alexandria, Virginia. How did I get to Alexandria, Virginia? Well, very interesting. So I mentioned earlier about my father-in-law, who's a Baptist preacher. In 83, he was a pastor in Alexandria from 1966 to 96, 30 years in the same church, downtown Alexandria, right on South Washington Street. If you go to South Washington Street, you pass Downtown Baptist Church. That's the church he pastored for 30 years, okay? So there was a couple that grew up in his church, but they married, and they moved to the suburbs, and they had little girls. Their girls are grown and married and got kids of their own now, but they were little girls, and they felt like they needed a church closer to their home. So they started going to another church. This church, their pastor resigned. Steve, this man, was called to be on the pastor search committee. So he was the vice chairman of the pastor search committee. So Steve knew me because I had been at my father-in-law's church and preached there several times while Steve was there. So Steve is on the pastor search committee at this church, and so Steve says, I know a guy we ought to call. So they called me. You see, I had never called them. I didn't even know they were looking for a pastor. Networking, that's an example of that. That is a key thing I'm really convinced in our day. I mentioned a little bit about my background, and I told I was in sales. So for a few years, I had my own small construction company. And one of the things that I did was I was involved in the local Chamber of Commerce and different organizations like that. Why did I do that? Well, it was a little bit of a chore to get up on every Thursday morning and to be at this meeting at 7:30, but I did that because I got to know people. And I sold a lot of jobs because people knew me, and they would say, oh, I need to have this railing fixed on my house. Oh, Bill can do that. And so it was a lot about networking. So that is a real key. Do the education. That is important too. If you're just starting, look at your field. I mean, don't get a degree in underwater basket weaving or something, because you're probably not going to get work in that field, Or if you go into a field like psychology, which is a great field to go into, just understand you're probably going to have to get an advanced degree. Sometimes it's very challenging and very difficult to find work, depending on the degree that you have. But networking, I think, is a key. And I don't think people really do that as much as they should.
I like that. That's awesome. We actually held one of our conferences on networking, because that's another thing that I feel I learned too late. But I guess, no better time than right now.
Yep.
But I like that. That's awesome. That was a really good question. Do we have any other questions at the moment?
That was it.
Okay, perfect. So for those of you just coming in, make sure you ask questions. I'm going to move on with mine. So Dr. Denning, you talked a lot about your college. Answer me this. Did you go to seminary?
I did.
Okay, what was that like? Where did you go to seminary? How does that work?
I went to Southeastern Baptist Theological Seminary, which is very near where we live. It's in Wake Forest, North Carolina. You mentioned PhD. I actually have a doctorate of ministry, which is a slightly different degree. It's a doctorate, but not a PhD. So didn't clarify that a moment ago, but now that you mentioned that. I think that the Southeastern does offer PhDs, but at the time I went, they didn't offer that particular degree. So it was a great experience for me in some ways, and a challenging experience in other ways. And so I can tell you a little bit about that if you're interested to know.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely.
So when I went to Southeastern, I sort of felt like I was in the minority. And what I mean by that is from a theological position. So I felt very challenged at times by faculty and others that were there. And again, this was back in I graduated college in 82. I started in 83, the fall of 83. So it's a little time frame. And I was, to be honest with you, I was pretty discouraged after my first year. I had not planned to go to Southeastern. I had planned to go to another seminary when I graduated college. But when I got called to this little church I mentioned earlier, it was not an option to go to Texas to seminary. So I realized if I was going to get a master's degree and do that at seminary, it would be Wake Forest at Southeastern. So after my first year, I was pretty discouraged, quite honestly. And I told my wife, we got married after my first year of grad school, and I took the fall semester off, the fall of 84 off, because we only had one car, and she was finishing her bachelor's degree at Campbell, where we had met.
Okay.
And so I said, I'm going to go back in the spring and take a semester break. And I told my wife, I said, if things are not better for me, I'm going to do something different. I'm going to go one more semester. And if it's not better, I'm going to do something different. I went back in the spring of 85, and I had 4 classes, which is pretty normal load in grad school, and 2 of the classes were with the same professor. I had heard some about this professor, but I didn't know him personally. That guy was such an inspiration to me. As a matter of fact, by the time I finished the spring semester, having 2 of my 4 classes with the same professor, my whole perspective had changed. I got to know him really well. His grader, they had students like myself that would grade all the papers and stuff, was graduating, and so I had gotten to know him and the professor, and so the professor asked me to be his grader starting the next year. So I did that in the fall of '85, and I did that for 2 years. I graduated in the spring of '87, and what I discovered was, because I was up in front of students, because I was his grader, the first day of class, he would come in and introduce himself and say, this is a class and this is what we're going to do, and then Bill's going to give you the syllabus and talk with you about what you need to do in the class, and then he would kind of exit the room. And so everybody knew me. And I mentioned earlier about having what I consider to be ministry and encouraging people, and I felt like there were other people like me that were there that were discouraged like I had been in that first year. And this forum in front of them, working with this professor, gave me an opportunity to influence them and to encourage them. So I kind of changed my perspective on school. And so that was a really good thing. It was challenging. It's like any other grad school. I mean, it's hard. I mean, it's, you work hard, and you got to, and I was, pastoring this little church, and I was driving an hour one way. Had classes at 8 in the morning. I tried to get done by noon so I could be back in the community by 1. But so it was challenging and it was good at the same time. It turned out to be really a good thing. When I graduated in '87, I worked on a post-grad program, and the professor asked me to be his teaching fellow, so I actually did that for a year and a half. And then I never finished that degree. All the classes in that program that I took were all doctoral level classes, and so when I entered the doctoral program, I was able to use many of those classes, so it worked out very well for me. That professor, though, was one of the people I really, to this day, have tremendous respect and admiration for, and try to model what I do as a professor, because I felt like him, because I felt that encouragement. And you've been in my class this quarter, and I try to make the class not just interesting and so forth, but I want to encourage students. I want to help students, and that has come out of a lot of what I experienced with that professor. I had one in college like that too. The philosophy professor in college was, in fact, he preached my ordination sermon. That's how much I appreciated him. But this Dr. Delos Miles was his name. He's still living. He's down in Columbia, South Carolina. He's probably late 80s. But just a great man, and so much of what I've done as far as trying to encourage and help students has come out of what I saw him do for me. It's a good experience.
You still talk to him every once in a while?
I don't. I've sort of lost contact with him. I was down in Columbia in November of last year. My neighbor here, one of his daughters was getting married in Columbia, and they had asked me to do the wedding, and I was so excited because when we moved to this neighborhood, she was a little girl, about 5 years old or 6 or something. So it was kind of a cool thing. I tried to look him up to figure out exactly where he was. I know he's in that area. I had a little difficulty doing that, and so I had another college friend that we were trying to connect with as well, and just time being limited like it was, I just didn't get to see him. But he has been, and I told him this on a number of occasions. As a matter of fact, when we left North Carolina and moved to Virginia in 1990, the church that we were there did this sort of like This Is Your Life thing for us on a Sunday night, and he came to that, and a lot of other people were there. And I told him many times just how much, his influence has, helped me. I don't know that I would have stayed in grad school were it not for him.
Yeah.
And that's just how much of an impact he made.
It's amazing. Sometimes I think more often than not, we don't necessarily realize our purpose. And many times our idea of what that purpose might be is a little bit different than what other people have in mind or other people even need.
Yeah.
And I see two sides of that relationship there, and that is the purpose that he was serving, which a very small portion of that was to help get you realize what your purpose was and kind of alter your perspective there. And that's really interesting.
Yeah. If I could have that kind of influence on another person, and I'll just use a student, for example, because I'm in that environment now, I'd feel like a good part of the purpose and reason I've been put on this planet would have been fulfilled. And so it's been encouraging to me. I've had students come to me, and I actually had a student not long ago tell me, you're the reason I decided to finish my degree. And that means a lot to me. I mean, it really does. That's just, it makes me very emotional when I hear stories like that, or when I see a student. My first quarter teaching in the summer of 2012, I taught a religion class, and I offered, as I've offered in our class, if you want to send me your papers early, I'll be happy to review them, make suggestions, and so forth. I do that every class. Nobody in that first class took me up on that until they got their grades on their first paper. And so this young lady, wonderful young lady, moved here from New York State, recently divorced, had 2 teenage children. She was late 30s, a typical student for us. She, after getting her first paper, and she just did not do well on it at all. I mean, from the content to the grammar to the formatting, just nothing was very good about it, to be honest. So I sat down with her and I said, yes, I'll take whatever time we need. We spent about an hour together. I would read a line and I would say, now, what does this mean? And literally she would say, I don't really know. And I said, well, now you wrote that. She said, well, yeah, I know I wrote it, but I don't know what that means, So she was, this was brand new to her. I mean, she'd never been to college, okay? So I worked with her. And although I don't teach English, I've been writing for so many years. I know English and grammar and so forth. Although you might not know that sometimes the way I speak, but that's another story. But anyway, so I worked with her. She did better on her next paper. She did better on her final paper. She had 4 classes with me. The last class that she had with me, she earned an A in that class. The last paper she wrote in that last class was outstanding. I was so thrilled when I was in Charlotte when we went to graduation and she graduated. I got a picture with her. I mean, that's, to me, so encouraging and so helpful. And she told me later, she finished her associate's degree and she graduated and she came back and finished up her bachelor's degree as well. But she told me, she said, that meant a lot to me that you would take that time. And it helped her in other classes because, as you know, you got to write papers in every class.
Yeah.
So to me, that's what this is about. And what really excites me when I can see that I've helped someone, in a real practical way like that.
I like that. And just knowing that the impact that you have on someone, sometimes you may not know it. So for every single person that comes to tell us, hey, Dr. Danny, you helped me so much, there's those other people that kind of take a back seat that you impact as well.
Sometimes
that's awesome.
you don't hear those stories, and that's okay too. Not everybody needs to come up and say that. Yeah. When I do hear that, it's pretty encouraging. It makes me know that there's others as well. So it's a pretty neat thing.
That's awesome. I like that. So early career, you already talked about your Christmas tree farm a little bit. Mm-hmm. Let's see here. What you may have answered this already. I'm going to ask it anyways because I'm really curious. So what led you into becoming the Passover Church, and what was the major influence in keeping you there for you to follow that 30-year career?
Yeah. That's a great question. I became a Christian at age 16. Really, I would describe it kind of a radical experience. Maybe not so, but I was a typical 16-year-old boy. I mean, I did everything 16-year-old boys do, that was me. My family grew up going to church. We never missed a Sunday. Matter of fact, I went before I was born because my mom never missed a Sunday. So I mean, I was always there. But when at age 16, I heard about a relationship with God, and that was not what I knew. I knew about religion, but I didn't know about relationship. So that began this journey for me. It was a long process of understanding what that means and how you live that out. And so in the summer of '77, I mentioned to you that earlier that I went 3 semesters in college. In the summer of '77, after my first year of college, I really felt like I was supposed to do something ministry related. I didn't think it was a pastor. I didn't know what it was. At that time, I was dating a young lady. We dated for a couple of years at that point, and I shared with her, and didn't get the positive feedback, and she was not really interested in living near mom and dad and all that. There's nothing wrong with that at all. But I just decided, I'm going to do something different. I'm not going to go that ministry route. And so after the 3rd semester, I was kind of unsure about what I needed to do, and that's when I dropped out of school. When I went back to school, it was because in January of 1980, after we sold that Christmas tree farm, I was actually driving a gas truck, an LP gas truck, and I was at a station where I was filling up the big tanker, and I was sitting there reading my Bible, and it was a cold, wet January day, January 2nd, 1980, and I read the 40th Psalm, and people may be familiar with that, but it said, "I waited patiently for the Lord. He inclined unto me. He heard my cry. He lifted me out of a horrible pit, out of the miry clay, set my feet upon a rock, and established my path. Many will see it and fear, and he put a new song in my mouth. Many will see it and fear and trust in God." And I really felt like through those verses that God was saying, "Okay, I'm going to give you a second chance here." 2.5 years earlier. And so I said yes. I said, "Okay, I don't know what this means. I don't understand, what that's going to look like." But I said yes, and it was almost immediately. It's kind of a weird thing. It's almost within a week or so, I became very dissatisfied with the job. There's nothing wrong with it. Nothing wrong with the people I worked for. Great folks. Nothing negative at all. But I just was very dissatisfied. So I went in on a Thursday and told the owner of the company I'd given him my 2-week notice. He said, "What are you going to do?" I said, "I don't know." He said, "What in the world? The very thing I told you not to do earlier, I did." I was 20 years old, whatever. But anyway, I gave him a 2-week notice. I left the office on this big truck, and I was headed down the road that my mom lived on, the little town of Benson where I grew up. She was living there. And I saw my dad's car in the driveway, so I stopped the truck and parked it out front, went in and said hello to him, and I told him what I had just done. He said, "What are you going to do?" I said, "I don't know." And he said, "Your uncle owns a small construction company. He's always looking for people to sell for him. Why don't you call him?" So I called him. My uncle was the quintessential tin man. He sold aluminum siding. He'd had this company for about 25 or 30 years. Literally knock on doors. And so he said, "Yeah, I'll let you work with me." I said, "Okay, what do I need to do?" He said, "You just knock on doors and sell siding." It's about all the training I got. And so before I worked my 2-week notice, I had sold my first siding job, and I made $300 on that job. I was making $125 a week driving the truck. I made $300 cash. I thought, man, I could do this. So I was like 20 years old, 22 years old, whatever. I didn't know, but to go back to your question, this is kind of leading up to it. So I quit the job. I started working that job. I didn't know at that point that I was going to be back in school in the fall of that year. But I needed a job that I could work my own schedule and make enough money to buy books and pay tuition because I was on my own. And so that's what I did. So I worked for this aluminum siding company, believe it or not. I literally knocked on doors, cold call, and I got people yell at me, curse at me, send their dog after me, you name it, I had it all, but I sold work. And every time I would talk to 100 people, I'd sell one job, make about $1,500. So I kind of had it down to a science. When I decided to go back to school in the summer of 1980, I decided I need to go back to school and finish my education. I interviewed 3 schools. I decided to go back to Campbell where I had been before. And I rented this little farmhouse from my grandfather. He and my grandmother built this house back in the 50s, and he'd moved out. So I rented a little house from him for $85 a month. Went back to school.
Yes, please.
Yeah, that was kind of cool. Went back to school, but I had the kind of job that I could work my own schedule. So I didn't have to punch in a clock. Plus, I made enough money that I could, pay tuition. Since I started working that job earlier in January of that year, I had stockpiled my money, so I could just write a check for the tuition for the fall.
Nice.
Which was, I finished my doctorate with less than $2,500 in student loan debt. I just didn't borrow money; I just made the money, and
Nice.
It was not an easy thing by any means. And I learned a lot of valuable lessons, about life during those days of knocking on those doors. But so anyway, I decided that I needed to go to do ministry. I really thought it was going to be in higher education. So when I went back to school, I talked to the philosophy professor. I was majoring in religion and philosophy. I really wanted to do something in that field in higher ed. But then, as I mentioned a little earlier, about 2 months before I graduated in October of '82, I graduated December of '82, I was invited to just come speak at this little church. Their pastor had resigned. They didn't have somebody to fill the pulpit. I preached. They invited me back the next Sunday, and the next Sunday, and the next Sunday. I was preaching a lot, almost every week somewhere. But my calendar was kind of free during the October through December. By the end of December, I really felt like I'm supposed to be the pastor of this church. But you don't really stand up on a Sunday morning and say, "Hey, guess what? I'm going to be your pastor." This doesn't work that way. So a little bit of the story there. I had one of the members of the pastor search committee, because I was preaching every single week there, and they called me to be the interim pastor, which was kind of a good thing in that sense. But one of the members of the pastor search committee called me and said, "Man, I've been thinking about this and praying about this thing, and I really think that you're the person we're supposed to hire." And I said, "Well, don't tell anybody. Let's just pray about this." And so in the next 3 or 4 weeks, every other member of the pastor search committee called me. And I told them the same thing. I said, "Don't tell anybody. Let's just pray about it." So they never told one another. Nobody knew that the other ones had done that. It's all true story. And so in mid-January, they went out to hear another pastor, and they came back on a Tuesday night and met, and they were talking about this pastor, and they said, "No, this is not the right person." And so finally, someone on the committee speaks up and says, "I really think Bill is the one." And somebody else says, "Well, I probably did something I shouldn't have done, but I've called him and talked to him about this." And they said, "You called him?" So did I. And everybody did. So they called me from the church office at my home and said, "We've discovered that we've all talked to you." I said, "Yeah, you have." And so I told them, I said, "Let's don't tell anybody. Let's just pray about this a month, and let's see if this is the right move." And so that's what we did. And so then in late February, they announced it to the church that they were going to recommend me, and it was a unanimous vote for me to get hired. So it was one of those things where it's kind of like clearly obvious, this is what I'm supposed to do. Even though I never really thought I was going to be a pastor, but it was like, okay, God, you don't have to tell me anything any different. I mean, this is pretty clear when everybody calls me, So that's how I ended up there. And I just, sort of my philosophy as far as my relationship with God, so of course, I'll just do what you tell me to do until you tell me to do something different. And so I stayed there for 7 years in that church. Church grew. As I mentioned earlier, we went from about 30 people that first Sunday I was there. I think maybe it's 32 people, if I remember correctly. We were averaging 166 with 2 services. Ton of college kids that were there. We probably had 50 or 60 college kids every single week from Campbell that would come all the way over. It was just kind of a cool thing, you know.
That's awesome.
And then when I went to Alexandria, it was like I just sort of knew this was the time to leave, and I wasn't quite sure what that meant. And I told you already about Steve, who called me and said, you know, I talked to your father-in-law, and I heard that you were thinking that maybe you need to leave, and we're interested in you. And so that was one of those things that it was like, clearly this is what I'm supposed to do. And so we were there for 10 years and 3 months in that church. So that's kind of the interesting story.
Yeah.
You know, and it's
my favorite part of the whole story there is you said they called you from the office and they were like, we discovered that we all talked to you.
It's true.
And in my mind, you're like, I know.
Yeah, that's exactly right. You're all right.
I was there.
Yeah,
Remember? Yeah. So this one's going to dig a little deeper into some of the stuff you just talked about, but it focuses on just one day.
Mm-hmm.
What was your first day as a pastor like?
Well, it's interesting because I mentioned to you that I was preaching in this church and then I became interim pastor. So I don't really remember the exact first day because it was kind of a process, but I'll tell you about one day that I always remember. And that was when I became pastor of the church. I was single. I became pastor in March of 83. I didn't get married until August of 84. Now, Jenny and I were dating, but we weren't even engaged at that point. But I remember there was a couple that had some connections to the church. They had been married about 15 years or so, maybe 20. I don't remember exactly. But were having some problems. So here I am at 25 or 26, single, no experience with marriage at all, brand new pastor, and this couple says, can we come talk with you? I said, sure, yeah. So they come and they just pour their heart out, this problem they're having in their marriage, and they're asking me, and all I can think about was, are you kidding me? You're asking a 25-year-old single guy who's never been a pastor but like for 2 weeks or a month, and you're talking to me about what to do. You got to be kidding. I mean, I'm thinking this, but of course I didn't say anything like this. But that I remember thinking how unprepared I am for this role with questions like this. And so I don't even remember what happened. They stayed together. I do remember that. They stayed together. I don't know if it had anything to do with what I said to them or not, but that was yeah. So I don't know. I'm not taking credit for that at all, but I do remember. I just like, you got to be kidding me. I had that experience many times where people would come to me and I would think, man, I would just never say this to them, and I'm thinking, you got to be kidding me. I have no idea what to tell you to do here, So sometimes I learned a long time ago that sometimes when someone asks you a question, the best thing you can do is say, you know what, that is an awesome question. I have no idea but if you give me some time to go do some research, I'll come back with an awesome answer for you. Instead of trying to fumble through it, when you don't know the answer. So
let's find out together.
Yeah, come on, that's right.
I've been in those situations before. I can just picture you sitting at the desk. We'll just listen to what you have to say, and in your head you're going, I have no idea.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
That's awesome. That was a good story. Another one of my questions, I guess, was kind of carbon copy, was what was one of your most memorable days?
Yeah, that was no doubt.
So I'd love to move on now to some current events that are going on. We are soaking up quite a bit of time, and for anyone that might be just joining in late, this is Dr. Denning. He has a lot of experience. He's telling us about the things he went through with his early life, his college life, his career. the places he's been and the experiences he's had has shed quite a bit of light just on some of the things that I have going on right now. So if you guys have questions, be sure to post them in the comments section. We have somebody off screen that's going to help us out with those. But Dr. Denning, I want to move into some current events. I'm going to start with some things that you will be familiar with, and I want to get your thoughts and insight on it, and then I'm going to move into some things and get your thoughts and position on that. But the first thing I want to ask about, which I'm sure we'll have some follow-up questions here, is what are your thoughts and experiences with the stock exchange and investing, and what do you have to say about all that stuff?
So I do not claim in any way to be an expert in that field. So one of the things I have kind of learned early on is if I am wanting to do something, one of the best things to do is to go find someone who's doing it and doing it well. In 2005, I was introduced to Dave Ramsey. Some people have heard of him. Many people have heard of him. He's got, I think, the third most popular radio show in America. I actually went through his course in 2005 for the first time. And then I became a coordinator and actually led the course a number of times. And so I really have depended on, when it comes to things like investing, stock exchange, all those kinds of things related to that, to people that are what Dave Ramsey describes as his endorsed providers. So recently, my wife and I went and met with one, it's been a few months ago, where we shifted some money over. It kind of relates to something we were talking about earlier about investing for retirement. So we at point blank asked him, here's what we were doing, this is what we've done, what would you suggest? And he just gave us the baby steps to Dave Ramsey, and I thought, that's pretty cool,
And check.
Yeah. So that's been my primary experience. I trust I trust Dave Ramsey and what he teaches, and I've read, I think I've read everything he's written, actually. And the folks who endorse local providers, there may be a different term they use for them now, but those are the people that and there's one in particular that we've dealt with that I trust what they do and have leaned upon them for those areas. So I see the stock market this year as kind of going gangbusters from everything that I see. My son, who works with an investment company, got a big bonus, as a matter of fact, yesterday.
Nice.
Which is really cool. And it had a lot to do with the way the stock market is done this year. So
that's pretty cool.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't study that as much as I probably should, but it seems like to me, since the presidential election, whether you like Trump or don't like Trump, it seems like to me that the stock market has made some headway and at least moving up. I don't know if it had anything to do with him or not, but it'd be interesting to see how it all kind of unfolds.
Yeah. And one of the main reasons I asked that is because what I found is growing up, I had very little to no experience or knowledge of it and how it worked. And what I found out recently is primarily because my parents later on in my, later in childhood, my parents went through Dave Ramsey and they paid attention to him and learned a lot of things. And I believe that the best way to learn anything, especially when it comes to finances, is to always seek out that expert.
Yep.
Which Dave Ramsey is one I would highly recommend, as well as Tony Robbins. Just learn from someone who focuses on that area. But when I was in the Army, probably now 10 years ago while I was in Iraq, I invested a few $100s. Like, I'll invest in the stock market, left it there a year, didn't do anything, didn't know what I was doing, pulled it out and bounced. I broke even. I was like, whatever.
Yep. And
then learning how it was long-term later on and how to do it and things like that, going to my own personal financial advisor and asking questions as well as seeking out the experts, I found it's not the mysterious black box that I always thought it was.
Right.
So I definitely wanted to get your perspective on that. And it's going to lead us into some follow-up questions. So I'm going to move into, I guess I didn't write it down here, but the cryptocurrency thing that's going on, which originally started back in 2009 with Bitcoin. I wanted to get your opinion of that, or any knowledge or experience that you have with that?
I don't have a lot of experience with that. I'm familiar with Bitcoin. I know there are a lot of places that are taking Bitcoin now. Something my gut kind of tells me that in the decades to follow, that currency is not going to be paper anymore. We're moving in that direction anyway with just the use of debit cards and so forth like that. Or if you've got a credit card, that kind of thing. So it would not be surprising to me that at some point in the future that people would look back and say, you know, people used to use paper money, seriously? Or use a...
Why?
Yeah. And not to scare anybody from a religious standpoint, but I could foresee a time when you'd have chips embedded so that you don't carry around a debit card. I mean, some people would, oh, that's the mark of the beast or whatever, kind of scary kind of thing. But I can foresee, that. I mean, I think about I got my wallet with my debit card, and I updated my debit card with someone in Mexico decided to use my debit card.
Of course.
Yeah. So they sent me one with a chip in it now, but I can foresee a day when it's going to be electronic. I think it's pretty interesting. It really is. My boys know much more about Bitcoin, and they've tried to explain to me how it works. And at our management meeting back in April down in Florida, they had a futurist there, and she talked about Bitcoin and how it folds over, and she described it. It was beyond my understanding, but she was talking about how she thought that, like even higher education, that you got to look at Bitcoin in the future, and this is her thinking about that. So anyway.
Okay.
I don't know a lot more about that, but I think it's pretty fascinating to me. I'm techie. I like all the tech stuff.
I can tell when you're in class with your iPad.
Yeah.
I don't even do this, but right now every single electronic device I have is recording us live, so I had to rely on.
You could have used my iPad, man. I didn't think about that. Sorry about that.
It's all good.
It's even like your notes. I put it on my phone.
Yeah.
So I got it all on my phone.
You have what I have right there.
Exactly.
Yeah, definitely. That would be me if it weren't for all the devices. But you actually raised a decent question. Before we get too far, I want to see, do we have any questions from the audience? Because Bitcoin seems to come up a lot on my page, and I wouldn't doubt later on it'll just blow up and some people will be making comments and asking questions. But you mentioned a lady who was a futurist.
Yeah.
I might be the only one in the dark here, but what is that? Can you elaborate on that?
I'll try. So this person is one that looks at trends in society, and then sort of asserts what might happen and the way things might go. She's not, a prophet. She's not foretelling the future.
Right.
They don't, but they'll look at things and say, this is where we think we might be able to go with this, and what if this happened? She was talking about higher ed because it was a management meeting for our university, and I found it kind of interesting. She talked about people who, let's say, are experts. Let's say you have a person who's an expert in a specific field. They might use Bitcoin, and you might be able to take a class with that person, and that class be credited towards your bachelor's. This is what she was talking about in the future. So our university might take that as a transfer credit, or we might actually have, some connection with that individual, and it could be in anything. So you might not have adjunct professors in the sense that we think about them, or full-time professors in the sense that we think about them today, but you might have someone who's an expert who maybe doesn't even have a doctoral degree, maybe doesn't have a master's degree, but they have expertise in a specific area, that kind of thing. So the first book I ever read from a futurist was a book called Future Edge. I read it about 25 years ago by Joel Arthur Barker, I think was his name. I probably got it on my bookshelf because I was one of those books I told my wife when I gave away my library, it was one I had to keep. And I don't remember much about the book because there's so many, but I was a part of an entrepreneurial network back in the early 90s, and that was one of the books that we read, and that was very interesting to think about, what's going to happen in the future. That's what the futurist does.
That's awesome. Okay. I just never heard that term before. That's pretty interesting. But I'd like to read that book too.
Yeah.
You called it Future Edge?
Future Edge.
Edge.
It was written early 90s, maybe late 80s or early 90s.
Okay.
Joel Arthur Barker, I'm pretty sure, is the author. We can look it up, but yeah.
Audible. I've probably got credits.
Probably. Yeah.
So this next one, this is going to be pretty interesting. But I think I asked you this in class, but there's a huge thing going on right now, and I've actually I thought I had both perspectives presented to me already, and my dad actually presented kind of a third one, and then I listened to an interview. But what do you know about net neutrality, and what is your opinion of that? How do you believe it's going to affect, students and workers?
I've read a little bit on it since you and I talked about net neutrality, and I'm not sure that I have a good, solid opinion on that, to be honest with you. There's something about having internet available to all people and not throttling things down and so forth that is appealing to me, just because of the information that's out there. Particularly if you're trying to do something like you're doing here, you wouldn't want people to be limited, I think. There's another part of me, and I may not understand this completely, but another part of me that says, if you've got a company that is providing the internet service, then they should have some say in, so there's a little bit of tension for me about that. I remember when we went to our current cell phone carrier a year ago, last month, I asked about that because I had read online that they throttle things down after you get a certain amount of data and so forth, and I remember kind of not getting a straight answer exactly. At least I didn't think I did.
I feel like in those cases, sometimes depending on who you're asking the question to, it's that they may not have as firm of a grasp on it. So then now they're trying to explain it to you, and you feel like you're getting a runaround on it. Yeah. But that may be a loaded question on my part, just because apparently there's a lot more going on. And the interview that I did listen to, which I'm really glad my dad brought it up, the interview that I listened to was with the commissioner of the FCC. Mm-hmm. Now, where I believe you would be very interested in this is some of the things that he's gone through by simply being the name on the event. And that is just, now, to me, I don't care who you are, what your stance is, where you live, or anything like that. I don't believe people deserve to be treated in such a way and have their lawns picketed, have their families scrutinized and receive that kind of mail, which I've heard of even pastors getting hate mail or emails and stuff like that. I don't think anyone deserves that. Right. So that's one of the most interesting things, and it's funny because everybody thinks about net neutrality. I think we get a little bit selfish. How does it affect me? Well, yeah, but this guy is, he's got a job to do, and I'm sure there's other people involved too. He has a job to do, and granted, okay, it was his idea to present it, and he's got thoughts and opinions behind the reason why, but he also has a family. And what do they have to do about this? Right. It's like, why would you treat another human being like that? Right. But I didn't mean to drag you into something that we're not familiar with, but I'm definitely curious on everyone's thoughts on that. Right now, the internet is freaking out over net neutrality.
Yeah, so. I did read a little something about it in the last couple of days, and I need to do some more research and reading for sure.
I just think it's fun. I'm a believer that things are just going to happen no matter what. So kind of like you said, take personal responsibility. My dad used to say growing up when we were eating, worry about your own plate. I'm not worried about what I got going on, and what happens, definitely. So the last few questions I have for you, Dr. Denning, they're kind of fun. I actually stole these from a podcast I listened to called The Top. Okay. How many hours of sleep do you get each night?
I try my best to do 7 hours at least. I have a little Fitbit I got for Christmas last year. It tracks that. And we actually at work, we have an app that the Fitbit actually syncs to, and they talk about needing 7 hours sleep. So I try to do my best to do 7. Now I'll have to be honest. There's sometimes I don't get 7. I just don't. But that's my goal. That's my goal.
Okay. And well, I think we already know the answer to that. What's your situation? Single, married?
Married,
of course.
Yeah.
Like I said, I stole these, so I guess they don't necessarily fit in. I'm going to ask it anyways because I might hang on to them. They're decent questions, especially for someone that's like, I want to mimic what you're doing, or I want to take your advice and apply it. Then, okay, now we sound like a similar person. We got a lot in common. This is probably the best fit for me. Who are you currently following? Role model, speaker, etc.
A couple people come to my mind. One is my father-in-law. I mentioned him already on a couple of occasions. I have great respect for him. When I was a young pastor and had no idea what I was doing, I talked about that a little earlier, I am sure that there were things that I did and he would look at with his many years of experience at that point and probably would scratch his head and wonder, why is Bill doing that? He never volunteered advice. He would never give me advice unless I asked him for it. I'm sure that there were times that he would think that's just a mistake and you shouldn't do that, but he never did that. And I told him this recently on the phone. I talked to him about that. I like that, and that has been a big influence, in my life. It really has been. We go to Elevation Church, which is based in Charlotte, and Pastor Stephen Furtick is the pastor there. I've never met him personally because we go to the Raleigh location, at least at Millbrook High School. I have a tremendous respect for him because I know what that role is like. Although I never pastored a church with 17 campuses or 19, whatever it is now, and never did that. But I know what it's like to have to prepare something for every week. And one of the things that I admire about him and really appreciate about him is that he comes with something that's fresh, something that is applicable to my life, which is kind of, sometimes, you go and you hear someone speak about something and you think, well, that's good, but it really doesn't apply much to me. I have to say that there's never been a Sunday yet that I've gone that I thought, this doesn't apply to me. Every Sunday is like there's something there for me. And I really do appreciate him. Our campus pastor, so Pastor Stephen is the lead pastor, the senior pastor. But our campus pastor is a young man, the little boy that's about a year old, he and his wife. I see a lot of myself in Preston. Preston Stack is his name. Great young man. I'm just so thrilled to be able to connect with him and his life. So that is a person that is also, I get to see him just about every week. I have a little conversation with him, and I'm very grateful for that kind of connection. So those are some of the people that come to my mind. Nice. Yeah.
That's awesome. So now you are your father-in-law.
Kind of, yeah. In some ways, maybe.
In a way. So the last question I have, I know you read about a book a minute.
No, not quite.
What book are you reading right now?
I'm reading a couple books. One is called The Reason for God by Timothy Keller. That is the one I'm probably listening to the most. And I do a lot of Audible books, as I mentioned earlier. I just listened to another book written by a CNN correspondent, and I'm having a brain cramp. I can't think of his name nor the title of the book. It was about asking questions and how to develop good questions to ask. It'll come to me in a minute. But anyway, I've got into that book actually a little bit today, nice. Which is pretty cool. I really like Stoic philosophy. So there's a number of different books that I've read on Stoic philosophy that I really have liked. Ryan Holiday, if you're familiar with him, you can look him up online. He does a lot with Stoic philosophy. Those have been some of the ones recently. But I read so much, it's really about a book a week.
Right.
Yeah, it really is about that much. Sometimes they start running together. Sometimes I'll go back to a book and just go through it a second time or a third time. Sometimes I read a book called How Can I Forgive You? I went through that book 6 times. It was just that good for me.
Nice.
It's so practical for me. I can't think of the author I'll think of it in a moment. That was really a very good book. Matter of fact, I liked it so much I actually took notes on many of the chapters. So there's a lot of good ones out there. I've read Night Woods is a novel by James Patterson, maybe.
Okay.
My wife is always asking me about, you need to read a novel. You need to read a novel. So we read that one together. That was good, actually. So
I like that. So, and I'm going to add one here on the end. I want you to talk about this because I do the same thing, and I learned it probably from Gary Vee or somebody else. But what you do Audible for most of your books.
Mm-hmm.
I do that. It's much more convenient to listen sometimes if you can't get, and in the car too.
Yep.
But how do you do it? Don't you speed it up?
I do, actually. My
Yeah.
wife is always after me, would you please put this on normal speed when she's in the car with me or something. But I'm an Audible auditory learner.
Mm-hmm.
I mentioned earlier about different personality styles. We didn't really talk much about that, but I found that to be very, very good. I can listen to it, and I do actually speed it up, believe it or not. Usually at least 1.5 times speed, sometimes 2, depending on who's reading. Sometimes you can do 2 and still really get it. And that has to do with the fact that I know how the brain processes words.
Right.
And you can process more words than a person can actually talk. And so I found that just to be helpful. And that's what I'll do many times.
I asked you that because I do the same thing, and I learned it, and I was like, what? And Audible has a function where you can go up to 3 times the speed.
Yeah, I've tried that. It was too fast for me. But
I brave it sometimes,
Yeah.
but sometimes, depending on who the speaker is, it's a little difficult to understand.
Yep.
But then I saw a TED Talk which talked about what you just talked about, and the lady, I can't remember who it was, but she was talking about how the average human can speak approximately 250 words a minute, but you can hear 500.
Right. I saw that same TED Talk.
Oh, really?
Just recently, yeah, actually.
What was the name of the lady?
I knew you were going to ask me, but I can't remember.
I was hoping because, put it out for everybody to watch. But yeah, I saw that one. I thought that was really interesting. But I wanted to ask you about that because you're like the second person I met who takes Audible and speeds it up.
Yeah.
I was like,
Nice. I do that, and again, you have to kind of listen to the person reading the book, and it depends on their speed. Sometimes you can do it even faster, but generally about 1.5 or 2 times is what I'll do.
Yeah. You get the information quicker, read more books. I like it.
That's true.
Do we have any last minute questions from the audience?
I do not.
Okay. Well, I think that about brings us to a close.
Thank you, man. It's been awesome.
I do appreciate it. I appreciate your time. I appreciate everybody that tuned in, and Toya for being our producer and director, executive, whatever title she wants to take on this time. I usually give her a new one every time. Thank you so much, everyone, for tuning in. I will put together a video as professionally as possible. We are recording from several angles, so y'all will get to watch this on YouTube, Facebook, and whatnot. And I hope in the future we can get together and do another one.
Love to.
Maybe
Sounds
start
great.
seeing some growth both in my little organization and see where your videos take off and stuff like that.
That's great.
But thanks so much. I appreciate it.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I don't know how to